horror movies are special. For whatever reason, I find myself turning toward the darker forms of entertainment. The best part of the Halloween season, at least for me, is that I get to subject my often unwilling family to movies they may or may not be comfortable with because 'tis the season. And while I do get plenty of enjoyment of watching these movies oftentimes at 3 in the morning while I'm trying to fall asleep, I get even more enjoyment out of recommending horror movies to friends and family, and now I get to do it to a YouTube audience. So the purpose of this video is to recommend some horror movies for you to watch this Halloween season. This video is going to be semi-structured, not necessarily a top 10 ranking from worst to best or anything like that, more of a subtle increase from the less intense to the more extreme. My hope is that by arranging it this way, you'll be able to kind of select the movie that you want to watch based on your own preferences. Maybe you don't want something that's really, really intense and scary and something a little more lighthearted, or maybe you're like me and you want the real scary stuff. Either way, I hope this video does introduce you to something you may have not seen, or maybe you just haven't got around to seeing yet. As much as I love giving horror recommendations, I also, just as much, love to receive them. So if you have any great horror movies that you want to recommend, please leave them in the comments below. Be sure and like the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. So to start this whole thing off, I thought I would go with what I think to be the most accessible and easiest to get into type of horror movie to begin with. These types of movies are some of the first horror-related things that I started to watch, and that is the killer animal movie. Simple man versus nature. The types of movies that remind us that, despite the fact that we sit at the top of the food chain, all it takes is for one trip out into the ocean, getting lost in the woods, or scientific experimentation gone too far, to remind us how cruel and dangerous that nature can truly be. Everybody has seen and loves Jaws, and it inspired millions of shark movies that I won't even begin to try to dissect here. But with the massive success of Jaws came tons of imitators taking nearly every animal under the sun, and I do mean every animal imaginable, and making it either giant or a man-eating killer. Night of the Lepus did this with actual bunnies, Willard did it with rats, Arachnophobia and Kingdom of the Spiders did it with spiders. As you can see, I did not get any footage of these movies because I'm never watching them again. And the fantastic Lake Placid did it hilariously with a giant crocodile. I highly recommend Lake Placid, if not just for Betty White alone.
If I had a dick, this is where I'd tell you to suck it.
But going all the way back to the year 1980, before Lake Placid gave us the giant crocodile, Alligator gave us the giant alligator. Directed by Louis Teague, Alligator takes the classic urban legend of the sewer-dwelling alligator that's flushed down the toilet, only to survive and attack those who venture into the sewers, and adds to it by having the alligator feast off the remains of dead laboratory animals that were injected with an experimental growth hormone, resulting in it growing to massive size. The kind of movie you're getting here isn't deep or thought-provoking in any way, nor is it designed to be. They knew what kind of movie they were making here, and it shows, through some genuinely funny and self-aware moments that satirize the type of genre cliches associated with this kind of killer animal movie. Look, most of the time when I approach a horror movie, I want something that's a little more thought-provoking and captivating and disturbing, but man, sometimes I just want a giant alligator to break into a wedding and start eating people. The movie stars Robert Forster as the police officer who is on the hunt for the alligator, and he truly elevates this movie more than it is with his performance. You may recognize Forster from his appearances in Disney's The Black Hole, Mulholland Drive, or his Academy Award-nominated performance in Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown. But more than likely, you recognize him from his performance in Breaking Bad, as the man who can make you disappear. He reprised this role in the sequel movie El Camino and briefly in Better Call Saul. Sadly, Robert Forster passed away in 2019, the same day that El Camino was released. I honestly think that his performance in Alligator is what makes this movie so much more fun to watch. The special effects on display here are pretty impressive for the time, although there are a few shots where it's pretty obviously a normal-sized alligator on a miniature set, but I think that adds to the indie charm that this movie has. And fun fact, one of the special effects assistants on this film was a young Bryan Cranston, two Breaking Bad actors involved in the same movie about a giant alligator. I don't have a ton more to say here. It's a movie about a giant alligator. Go watch it. Killer animal movies can be pretty funny from their concepts to their execution, which perfectly leads me into one of my personal favorite subgenres of horror, the horror comedy. A good horror comedy, in my opinion, can balance both the scares and the laughs. The best can genuinely creep you out while also making you crack up laughing at the same time. Sam Raimi is very good at this. Evil Dead 2, I would say, is one of the best examples of this type of movie, if not the best.
Groovy.
Another great example would be Raimi's Drag Me to Hell. But Raimi isn't the only filmmaker that can do the horror comedy right. You've got the classic B-movie throwback Tremors, where Reba McEntire shoots a giant worm monster with a shotgun. Trick or Treat was a great anthology film that got a ton of laughs out of me. And I highly recommend Reanimator, one of my all-time favorite horror films about the demented scientist Herbert West, whose attempts to bring the dead back to life result in some hilariously gory insanity. The movie that I really want to highlight here, however, is a 2016 film from New Zealand called Housebound. It's about a woman named Kylie who, after a botched ATM robbery, finds herself under house arrest in her childhood home that her estranged mother thinks is haunted. Of course, Kylie thinks her mom is absolutely crazy until she starts to experience some happenings of her own. This leads to her falling down a rabbit hole involving the previous owners of the house and her trying to prove her experiences to many doubtful outsiders that mistrust her due to her criminal history. Without giving too much away about the plot, the realization about what actually is going on in the house is pretty terrifying. The scares here manage to be both absurdly funny and unnerving at the same time. The main trio of characters here, Kylie, her mother, and the security guy Amos, are all very likable and easy to get attached to. Amos specifically is probably the funniest character in the movie for me. Kylie herself is a very resourceful protagonist, one who avoids the brainless horror cliches that make a lot of protagonists suddenly stupid and needlessly putting themselves in danger. The film was written and directed by Gerard Johnston in his directorial debut, who, I'm not kidding, as I was writing this video, dropped the trailer for his newest film, Megan. Gerard Johnson is a talented filmmaker, and I really hope that his new film is a big hit so we can see more from him. I can't go into too much detail about Housebound without ruining some of its twists and turns, so if you want something that can be both scary and funny, check this one out ASAP.
Somebody grabbed my leg, but I only saw his hand.
How come my bracelet went off?
Why are you asking me?
Why don't you tell him what you really saw?
Why don't you shut up?
The next style of film that I'm talking about is one that sadly doesn't often venture into the realm of horror, and that is animation. I really wish that there were a lot more straight-up horror animated films. There's definitely creepy animated movies though, like your childhood classics Monster House, which is primarily creepy because of its very uncanny character models, and Coraline is just as creepy as it is beautiful, animated in spectacular stop motion. It's actually in stop motion that the next film I'm going to recommend to you is presented, and it's an animation that fully leans into the horror genre. We're starting to get a little darker now. The next movie is The Wolf House. Released in 2018, The Wolf House is, like Coraline, as beautiful to admire as it is utterly disturbing to experience. The plot of the film reinforces the idea that just because something is animated doesn't mean it's kid-friendly or made for kids at all. I hope that people who still hold on to that idea have their minds changed from movies like this. The Wolf House is presented as a propaganda film for a cult that the main character Maria escapes from and hides in an abandoned house that slowly begins to transform into a complete and total nightmare. If you can't tell, the stop motion here was carefully and painstakingly coordinated and designed. Rather than using miniatures, they used full-size models as well as painting the interior of the house frame by frame. This film took over 5 years to complete, and that hard work is felt in every single frame here. It feels like a fairy tale that's been twisted and warped, corrupted into something that was never meant to be seen. The animation here does something that live action rarely can, with full control over every single moment and the only limits being the creativity of those behind the camera. The way that this world contorts, rots, and transforms feels like it was all designed to elicit that uncomfortable feeling of being in an uncanny environment where you're losing your mind. I'm always on the lookout for more animated horror content like this, but I find it extremely difficult to find. I would never have even heard of The Wolf House if the great Super Eyepatch Wolf hadn't made a video talking about it. If you know of any more animated horror content, please leave a comment below. My actual introduction to the idea of more adult-oriented animated content that would eventually lead me to horror animation actually came from the world of Japanese anime, and it's from that world that my next choice comes from. I'm now going to recommend not only one of the greatest psychological horror films I've ever seen, but one of the greatest films I've ever seen. This is Perfect Blue. Directed by the highly influential and sadly lost too soon Satoshi Kon, Perfect Blue is a disturbing, violent, visually stunning deep dive into a fractured mind, torn apart by the idea of perception and the identities that we create. Perfect Blue tells the story of Mima, who is a popular idol singer who announces to many disappointed fans that she is leaving her singing career behind to pursue a career in acting. What follows is a beautifully frightening look into the downward spiral of Mima's mental state when faced with the idea of how the world perceives her, how she wants to be perceived, and how she perceives herself, all while a terrifying and violent stalker begins to threaten and murder those around her. With Perfect Blue, we are moving into some very dark territory. From here on, the movies that I talk about are going to be a lot less fun and comedic, and I'm going to take the time here to say that while recommending Perfect Blue in the past, I have failed to give proper warning for some of the content that's featured within it. This is a very intense movie that does contain some scenes of very graphic sexual violence, so if any of that is triggering or disturbing to you, you may want to skip this one. Similar to The Wolf House, what Perfect Blue does so well through its animation is taking the world we are shown at the beginning and distorting it. As our lead character begins to question what is and isn't real, so do we. The longer the film goes on, the harder it is to actually tell if what Mima is experiencing is truly tragic events in her life or simulated moments on the television show that she's starring in. Lines of dialogue will make their way from the real world and into the show, and vice versa. A character we think is addressing Mima in one scene could suddenly be revealed to be talking to the character that she's playing. It goes so many layers deep that when Mima is pursued by the obsessed stalker, or even more terrifyingly, the spectral image of her idol self, it feels like there's no escape for this character, and the reality that she knows is falling apart. And even more disturbingly, the question begins to arise, are these threats even real, or is Mima her own worst enemy? Satoshi Kon was a master at exploring the minds of the characters that he would create. The direction here is absurdly precise. Every small detail is carefully planned out, from the quiet moments of Mima alone to the horrific scenes of graphic violence. And, as has been pointed out by several discussions and videos on this film, the eerie predictions of early internet culture and how that can serve as a breeding ground for unhealthy behavior over celebrities has become terrifyingly more relevant now than when it was released back in the late 90s. Perfect Blue is a masterpiece, and if you don't think that some of the themes there are too intense, I highly recommend checking it out. Of course, it wouldn't be Halloween without mentioning the good old-fashioned slasher flick, of which there is an abundance that you can choose from. Obviously, you can't go wrong with John Carpenter's Halloween. It's a classic and a staple of the entire genre. The film is still effective to this day, and I watch it every single Halloween night. You've got your Friday the 13th, you've got your Nightmare movies, but even before those monster franchises, you had The Town That Dreaded Sundown, the plot of which was loosely based on actual events that took place in the 1940s in Texas. And of course, if we're talking about movies that take place in Texas, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the highly influential Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a film that, despite its reputation, is actually much more atmospheric and realistically disturbing than the gory slasher that it seems to be known as now. Alice, Sweet Alice was released the same year as The Town That Dreaded Sundown and has a heavy religious undertone and a very creepy looking killer to go along with it. But it's actually to Canada and to the furthest holiday from Halloween possible that I want to turn to for my next recommendation. Released back in 1974, Black Christmas is one of the most influential films in the slasher genre, predating even Halloween. The film takes place in a sorority house during Christmas while a deranged killer hides out in the attic. While a lot of slashers do their best to create an instantly iconic killer with a signature weapon and character design, in Black Christmas we never really get a good look at the killer. He's always obscured by shadow or behind POV shots, and while most killers are silent, he's anything but. Typically, while slashers can be violent and gory, they don't disturb me too often. Something about Black Christmas, though, just gets under my skin. I think it might be the juxtaposition of the constant holiday music being paired with the horrific murder sequences. It's this weird assault on the senses. It also takes itself way more seriously than other movies in the genre. With home invasions being already a terrifying concept, the fact that you know the killer is just waiting up there in the attic the entire movie keeps you on edge the whole time. Like Alligator, Black Christmas took inspiration from urban legend, specifically the one about phone calls coming from inside the house. There's some really haunting imagery in this movie that would later become iconic, specifically the shot of the body in the rocking chair. That's usually the first thing that I think about when I hear the title of the movie. If you're looking for a genuinely unnerving and highly influential slasher, I can't recommend Black Christmas enough. And speaking of highly influential horror, the next movie I'd like to look at is Dario Argento's 1977 horror masterpiece, Suspiria. Nowadays, a lot of horror relies on darkness and shadow in its visual language. They imply mystery and ambiguity after all. Where Suspiria stands out is in its use of color. Bright, blinding, gorgeous color. While films like Black Christmas insist on a more grounded and real way to present their horror, Suspiria wants to put you in a trance. The way that the film is shot makes it feel otherworldly and hypnotic. The movie, about an American dancer who travels to a German dance school that's hiding a supernatural secret, puts you, like the main character, under its spell. The colors and lighting change with the mood of the scenes. Washes of deep blues, sickening greens, and when there's an act of violence or the threat of violence, a harsh red punctuates it. This is a gorgeously shot movie. Director Dario Argento actually sought to make the film like a dark fairy tale, even citing Disney's Alice in Wonderland, Pinocchio, and Snow White as influences on the visuals. The final ingredient that makes Suspiria so special is its amazing soundtrack, composed by the Italian prog rock band Goblin in collaboration with Argento himself. Dario Argento and Goblin were inseparable throughout most of his career, their music adding to the eerie and hypnotizing feel of his movies. Suspiria would truly be lesser without its amazing soundtrack. Suspiria is as beautiful to look at and listen to as it is unnerving to experience. We've now officially moved past the fun horror movies. With these last few picks, we are really going to be venturing into some dark stuff here. And I found that a lot of films outside of the US just really are not afraid to go there. To really pull back that layer of safety that we feel from the screen and seek to get inside our heads and live there many days after we've seen the movie. And I think that Japan is just really good at these types of movies. In 1999, a year after Perfect Blue, we got Audition. It should be said that Audition is a slower movie, taking its time to build up to its more infamous moments. This movie has a reputation. It's about a widowed father who is encouraged by his son to remarry after many years of being single. He happens to be friends with a film producer who sets up a pretty messed up way for him to meet a woman, holding a fake casting call in which the multiple women try out for the part of his wife in a fake movie. These women reveal a lot about their personal lives without knowing that they're being put on display as a potential partner for this one guy. That's already creepy. The father immediately falls for one of the women named Asami, pursuing her romantically, and they seem to hit it off pretty well. However, it's pretty clear that Asami is a little off. And the more that we learn about her past, the more apparent it becomes that this isn't going to end well. Without revealing too much, there are some pretty graphic scenes in this movie. It's all played with a level of realism that still manages to make me a little sick every time I watch it. Again, I don't want to say too much about the plot here because that would ruin it, but to give you an idea of what happens in the later scenes, this is listed as one of the favorite films of Eli Roth, who stated that it was a massive influence on him. Eli Roth is the director of Cabin Fever and Hostel. If you've seen those movies, you know what I'm talking about. Even though the legacy of Audition is tied to its more graphic sequences, the majority of the movie is actually devoted to the dialogue sequences between these two characters, who are both incredibly interesting and well written. This movie has a lot to say, and it even dips into some surreal territory towards the end. I won't go any further, just do yourself a favor and watch Audition. But prepare yourself. The last 4 movies that I want to talk about represent, to me, the most disturbing type of horror. These movies don't rely on cheap jump scares to get you. The imagery, the themes, and the actual moments of these next movies are so horrific that they will actually stay with you long after the credits roll. The first is a film from South Korea, and it is called The Wailing. Directed by Na Hong Jin. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name in any way. The Wailing is the longest of the movies in this video at about 2.5 hours. This is not the kind of horror movie that wants to scare you from moment to moment. It takes its time, creating this atmosphere of uncertainty and unrest growing in a small and peaceful village that eventually grows into terror and paranoia. The film follows a police officer whose village is mysteriously overtaken by an infection that makes people go insane and kill their families, leaving them as an empty husk that will later die. The The villagers all begin to suspect that the cause of this infection is a strange Japanese man that appears right before the incidents start. Our main character is at first skeptical of this until he starts to experience some strange dreams of the Japanese man, and after confronting him, finds his own daughter infected with the same strange affliction, eventually turning to total desperation to find a way to save his family. This desperation leads him to look toward the supernatural, consulting a shaman and ultimately realizing that there may be things that lie beyond his understanding, and who or even what he decides to place his faith in may be the difference between his family's salvation or its undoing. The horror of The Wailing comes from its ambiguity, taking the idea of faith and putting it to its ultimate test. The movie doesn't give you all the answers right away, and it makes you feel just as powerless as our protagonist. We watch helplessly as evil poisons and corrupts, but we rarely see the source of that evil. We're unsure if the answers that our hero seeks will be found in these bizarre rituals and superstitions he turns towards, or if he's even chasing the right man. All of this mystery, paranoia, and bleak hopelessness throughout culminates in The Wailing's final moments, taking the form of one of the most quietly intense and foreboding endings to any horror film I've ever seen, and I won't dare spoil it. The Wailing is phenomenal, insanely well acted, scored, and directed. It is constructed as carefully as any great horror classic, which is why I'm confident that, as time goes on, it will be remembered as one. It's rare that something that I would consider to be a modern horror classic comes into the public lexicon so quickly. The next movie I'm going to talk about came out only 4 years ago, and it's already been appraised as one of the greatest horror films of all time. It's been praised like crazy and analyzed even more, so I'm not sure how much I can add to that conversation, but I just couldn't leave it out of my Halloween recommendations. It's Hereditary. Hereditary is a film that, simply put, isn't afraid to go there. And its director, Ari Aster, if you know of his short film that he released before his directorial debut here, has never been afraid to go there. In the best ways, Hereditary reminds me of the horror classic The Shining, in that they are both horror films that center around the absolute devastation of a family. And both films, when I watch them, feel cursed. Like I'm seeing something that I'm not supposed to see. Annie Graham, along with her husband and 2 children, are dealing with the loss of Annie's mother, with whom she had a very strained and difficult relationship. After attending the funeral of her mother, Annie and her family soon begin to experience supernatural events, and what follows is this family absolutely falling apart. This is another one of those films that the more I tell you, the less you'll get out of it, so I have to be vague here. Very similar to The Wailing, Hereditary is not the kind of horror that wants to jump out at you every single scene. It's a horror that builds and builds and builds, slowly creeping its way into your mind and burrowing itself there for many days after you watch it the first time. And I say the first time because this is one of those films that you need to rewatch. Every single decision made, from the dialogue to the framing of the shots, requires multiple viewings to truly pick up on the genius of this movie. I want to give particular praise to Colin Stetson, whose soundtrack is just f***ing hauntingly beautiful, adding to this movie's oftentimes uncanny presentation. The biggest strength of Hereditary, however, is the performance from each of the main cast members, specifically the career-defining performance of Toni Collette. This isn't just some of the best acting in any horror film, this is some of the best acting I've ever seen. Hereditary combines all of the emotions of an intense family drama with all the unsettling terror of the greatest folk horror stories. I cannot recommend it enough, and odds are, if you're a horror fan, you've already heard of it. So quit wasting your time and experience Hereditary. The next one that I'm going to talk about is easily the most violent and intense movie in this entire video. There are not enough warnings that I can possibly give you to adequately prepare you for watching it. Simply put, this is not a pleasant movie to experience whatsoever. You simply don't go into this movie to have a good time, but to experience what I consider to be a horror masterpiece. It is uncompromising, it is bold, it is painful, it is Martyrs. To give you any idea of what you're in for with Martyrs, it's considered to be one of the most standout films of the filmmaking movement called New French Extremity. It was written and directed by Pascal Laugier, again, sorry for the mispronunciation, who admitted to not being in the best place mentally when he wrote it. A young girl named Lucy is able to narrowly escape the people who have been torturing and brutalizing her for over a year. While in an orphanage, she develops a close friendship with a girl named Anna. The scars of what Lucy has experienced are not just present physically, but mentally, and the years of anguish that she experiences from her past trauma cause her to seek violent revenge on those she believes responsible, bringing Anna along with her. While on her quest for revenge, Lucy begins to discover just how deeply she's been destroyed by her past and just how far she'll go. And Anna discovers something much more horrific about her friend and those who did this to her. If you decide to watch Martyrs, you will not leave the same person. This movie will change you. It will disturb you. It will devastate you. This is as close as you can get to an experience that you may not want to return to again. For as fantastic of a film as Martyrs is, it is not an easy one to revisit, both for its graphic content and for its bleak, nihilistic view of the world. Suffering is what this movie is about, and it does not pull any punches in showing you what suffering can do to you. This is a movie that I can only recommend if you really want to see how dark your Halloween celebration can get. I don't feel that I can fully recommend Martyrs to everyone, but if your taste in movies is similar to mine, just go in to experience it with caution. We have arrived at the very last movie I'm going to discuss in this video. Now, with the way that this video has been organized, you're probably wondering how I can get as depraved as something like Martyrs, or as devastating as Hereditary and The Wailing. And the answer is that I can't, and I'm not trying to. See, how you should be selecting the movies in this video is based on your personal preferences, based on your own personal tastes, and how you think that these movies will affect you and how you want them to. If your goal is to be scared, go by which of these movies you think will scare you the most. When wanting to experience something that is advertised as a horror film, I feel you have to ask yourself, what kind of horror do I want to experience? For me, the very last film in this video is not the scariest from moment to moment. It's not the goriest, there's not even any gore to be found, and it's not even the most disturbing movie here. But out of every movie that I went back and revisited in order to write this video, there is only one that I believe truly comes back to me almost daily. Randomly, I'll get up at night to go get myself a drink of water, and images from this movie will just pop into my mind. I'll find myself alone trying to relax, and I'll look over my shoulder because of this movie. I have even actually had haunting dreams because of what I experienced in this movie and what it made me think about. I think haunt is actually the best word to describe this movie. This movie haunts me. And it just might be, for me, the most underrated horror movie of all time. I would have never discovered this if it wasn't for some great YouTubers making fantastic videos about it. This amazing work of horror is called Lake Mungo.
I feel like something bad is going to happen to me.
While out swimming with her family, 16-year-old Alice Palmer drowns. Consumed with grief over the loss of Alice, the Palmer family claim to feel her presence looming about their house. A documentary crew films interviews with the family who detail their paranormal experiences and talk about how the loss of Alice has affected them. While many mockumentary or found footage horror films fail to completely absorb me in their illusion of reality, I truly believe that if I was not told beforehand, I would have 100% believed that Lake Mungo was a real documentary. Each of the actors that portray Alice's family and friends are so genuinely believable in a way that some of the greatest Oscar winners can only dream of being. The film never steeps into melodrama, and even the supernatural elements are played with an incredible amount of subtlety. The way that this movie scares me is not with what I'm actually seeing, but with what I think I might be. It's the little details that get under my skin. The way that the characters recount their experiences and what Alice's brother Matthew is able to capture on his video camera just feel real to me. You'll find yourself scanning every single bit of the scene to find something that you think you might have missed, and that is completely intentional. But even more than what Lake Mungo shows me, it's what Lake Mungo tells me that disturbs me the most. As the film goes on, the subject moves closer to the very idea of death itself, that death is certain, uncaring, and will come for us all, and it forces us to confront how we choose to live, knowing that the end is getting closer. As the documentary goes on, the more we learn things about Alice that even her family didn't know, and the film makes us confront another harsh reality, that even the ones we love the most may be hiding some of their darkest secrets just out of sight. Writer and director Joel Anderson stated that he saw the film as an exploration of grief, and I think that he also shows how grief can manifest itself in ways that we may not expect. I've seen tons of horror films with moments that I would consider to be scary or shocking, but when the family and documentary crew finally travel to the titular Lake Mungo, there is this moment that happens that haunts me to this very day. It is truly 100% one of the most chilling moments of any horror movie, any movie that I've ever had to watch. It's what sneaks up on me in my most private moments. It isn't just what we're shown that's scary, but it's what it forces us to confront on an existential level. This is a confrontational film that makes you stare down the barrel of things that you do not want to, and it does it with a quiet, subtle whisper of tragic horror. Now that I think about it more, Lake Mungo is not just a horror movie, it's a tragedy. Now, Lake Mungo may not disturb or scare you as much as it did me, and that's fine. That's why there's all these other movies to choose from that I talked about. As I said at the beginning, I think horror movies are very special in the fact that while many view them as this cheap popcorn thrill, and some of them are, I think fear is one of the most relatable human emotions, and I think that when we all get to sit in a room together and get scared together, we feel that much more closer. We get to discuss situations and themes that are a little more darker than we would want to. It's a crazy roller coaster ride, or it's a slow walk through the dark woods. Horror is such a diverse genre, and getting to experience that horror with friends and family is something that I love and cherish. Some of the greatest memories I've ever had are from watching horror movies on Halloween. So those are my horror movie recommendations for Halloween. I hope that the experience you get out of at least one of them is satisfactory. If you do watch one of the films that I've talked about, or maybe even multiple, please comment down below how it made you feel. Did you enjoy it? Also, recommend to me some horror movies to watch this Halloween. I'll check them out. Like always, thank you so much for sticking around and watching this whole thing. I know it was pretty long. Thank you so much. Catch you next time.